Welcome to Crime Time Inc. My name is Alex, and I'm your host today for episode 16 of our Charles Manson story. A single fingerprint. That's all it takes to connect a suspect to a crime scene. And on November 30th, 1969, Vincent Bugliosi got exactly what he needed. The phones between Independence and Los Angeles were burning up. Vincent Bugliosi and Inyo County DA Frank Fowles were averaging a dozen calls a day as the investigation intensified. News reporters had descended on Independence, and KNXT was sending a camera crew to film Golar Wash. Despite the media agreement to hold the story until December 1st, the pressure was building. Chief Davis of LAPD was furious about the leaks. So furious, in fact, that he suggested everyone working on the case, both at LAPD and the DA's office, take polygraph tests to identify who was talking. The suggestion was quietly ignored, with Buliosi resisting the urge to suggest they focus on catching the killers instead. On Saturday, Sergeant Patchett interviewed Greg Jacobson, a talent scout married to the daughter of comedian Lou Costello of Abbott and Costello fame. Jacobson had first met Charles Manson around May 1968 at the Sunset Boulevard home of Dennis Wilson, one of the Beach Boys. This interview would provide a crucial connection. Jacobson had introduced Manson to Terry Melcher, Doris Day's son, while Melcher was still living at Cielo Drive, the house that would later become the Tate residence and murder scene. Melcher was a producer involved in several enterprises, including a record company. Jacobson had tried to persuade him to record Manson's music. After listening to Manson play and sing, Melcher declined. While Melcher wasn't impressed, Jacobson had been fascinated by what he called the whole Charlie Manson package, the songs, philosophy, and lifestyle. He'd had many conversations with Manson over about a year and a half. Then came the bombshell. Patchett asked if Jacobson knew a Charles Tex Montgomery. Yes, Jacobson replied he knew him very well. Only his real name wasn't Montgomery. It was Charles Watson. Charles Denton Watson had been arrested in Van Nuys, California on April 23, 1969, for being on drugs. Though he had been released the next day, he had been fingerprinted at the time of his arrest. Sunday, November 30th, would prove to be the turning point in the case. Buliosi spent from 8:30 a.m. until midnight at LAPD headquarters. At 10:30 that morning, the latent print section called Lieutenant Helder with electrifying news. A print of Watson's right ring finger matched a latent print found on the front door of the Tate residence. Buliosi and Helder jumped up and down like excited children. This was the first physical evidence connecting any suspect to the crime scene. Helder immediately dispatched 15 detectives to locate Watson at his known addresses, but they came up empty. They did, however, learn that Watson was from a small town in Texas called McKinney, located in Collin County. Patchett called the Collin County sheriff, informing him that Charles Denton Watson was wanted for murder in California. The sheriff's name? Tom Montgomery. And in a twist worthy of fiction, Sheriff Montgomery was Watson's second cousin. Charles is now living here, the sheriff told them. He has an apartment in Denton. I'll bring him in. What happened next seems almost unbelievable. The sheriff called Watson's uncle, Maurice Montgomery, saying, "Can you bring Charles over to the jail? We've got some trouble." The uncle picked up his nephew and drove him to the McKinney jail in his pickup truck. He didn't say much on the way, the uncle later reported. I didn't know what it was all about, but I guess he knew all the time. Watson was placed in the local jail. LAPD assured Buliosi that Texans were straight shooters who would hold Watson until they could send an arrest warrant. Not taking any chances, Buliosi suggested they send someone to McKinney with the warrant. It was decided that Sergeant Sertucci and Nielsen would leave the next morning. With Manson, Atkins, and now Watson in custody, 2 suspects remained at large. From a ranch hand at Spawn, LAPD learned that Linda's last name was Kasabian, and she was supposedly in a convent in New Mexico. Marnie Reeves, also known as Katie, was rumored to be on a farm outside Mobile, Alabama. That same day, Patchett interviewed Terry Melcher about his contacts with Manson. He confirmed Jacobson's account about visiting Spahn Ranch twice to hear Manson perform and being not enthused. But Melcher added one crucial detail. On one occasion, late at night, Dennis Wilson had given him a ride back to his house on Cielo Drive, and Manson had come along, sitting in the back seat, singing and playing his guitar. They'd driven up to the gate and let Melcher out. Then Wilson and Manson drove away. This confirmed that Charles Manson had been to the Cielo Drive house at least once before the murders, though there was no evidence he had ever been inside the gate. The case was coming together piece by piece, but a major question remained. Would Susan Atkins cooperate? That Sunday afternoon, Buliosi spoke with Richard Caballero, a former deputy DA now in private practice, who was representing Susan Atkins on the Hinman murder charge. Earlier, Aaron Stovitz from the DA's office had shared with Caballero the evidence against his client, including copies of the taped statements from Ronnie Howard and Virginia Graham detailing Atkins's jailhouse confessions. Caballero came to Parker Center to meet with Buliosi and the detectives, asking what kind of deal they could offer. They told him that if Susan cooperated, they would likely allow her to plead guilty to second-degree murder, meaning no death penalty, but life imprisonment. Caballero went to Sybil Brand to discuss this with his client. He would later testify, "I told her what the problems were, what the evidence was against her as it was related to me. That included the Hinman case and the Tate-LaBianca case. As a result of all this, I indicated to her that there is no question in my mind, but they were going to seek the death penalty and that they would probably get it. I told her, they have enough evidence to convict you. You will be convicted." When Caballero returned to LAPD around 9:30 that night, he reported that Susan was undecided. She might testify before the grand jury, but he was certain she would never testify against the others at trial. She was still under Manson's control. Any moment, she could mentally return to him. The entire case now rested on a knife edge. Though they had the Howard Graham statements implicating Atkins and physical evidence linking Watson to the Tate murder scene, the entire case against Manson and the others depended on the decision of one person, the woman known in the family as Sadie Mae Glutz. Would she break from Manson's hold? Or would the most notorious murder case in American history collapse before it even reached trial? Vincent Bugliosi was in a race against time to build his case before the family can regroup, or silence those who might talk. December 1st, 1969. A case that had baffled investigators for nearly 4 months was about to explode into the public consciousness. But for Vincent Bugliosi, the pressure was just beginning. 7 a.m. The phone rang at Bugliosi's home. It was Aaron Stovitz with alarming news. Sheriff Montgomery of Collin County, Texas, had just called. If he didn't have an arrest warrant for Charles Tex Watson within 2 hours, he would release him. Buliosi rushed to his office and drafted a complaint. He and Detective McGann took it to Judge Antonio Chavez, who signed the warrant. LAPD teletyped it to Sheriff Montgomery with just minutes to spare. Watson would remain in custody. But Buliosi wasn't done. He also prepared 2 additional complaints, one for Linda Kasabian and another for Patricia Krenwinkel, now identified as the real name of Marnie Reeves, also known as Katie. After the Spahn Ranch raid, Krenwinkel's father, an insurance agent from Inglewood, California, had arranged for her release. When Sergeant Nielsen contacted him asking for his daughter's whereabouts, he revealed she was staying with relatives in Mobile, Alabama. LAPD had reached out to Mobile Police Chief James Robinson, who had officers searching for her. Then came another complication. Buck Compton, the chief deputy district attorney, called to inform Buliosi that LAPD Chief Edward Davis had scheduled a press conference for 2 p.m. that afternoon. Buliosi and Stovitz were expected to be in his office at 1:30. "Buck, this is way too premature," Buliosi protested. "We don't even have enough on Manson for an indictment, much less a conviction. As for Krenwinkel and Kasabian, if the story breaks before they're picked up, we may never catch them." He urged Compton to convince Davis to delay the announcement. Compton promised to try, but the wheels were already in motion. As it turned out, part of Bugliosi's worry was unnecessary. Patricia Krenwinkel was arrested in Mobile just before they arrived at Compton's office. The arrest itself could have been a scene from a movie. Mobile police had visited the home of Krenwinkel's aunt, Mrs. Garnet Reeves, but Patricia wasn't there. As Sergeant William McKellar and his partner were driving past the residence, they noticed a sports car with a young man and woman inside. As the cars passed, McKellar observed the female passenger pull her hat lower over her face, clearly an effort to avoid identification. The officers made a quick U-turn, turned on their sirens, and pulled the car over. Though the young woman matched the description from the teletype, she claimed her name was Montgomery, ironically, the same alias Watson had used. When taken to her aunt's house, however, she admitted her true identity. The young man, a local acquaintance, was questioned and released. Patricia Krenwinkel was read her rights and placed under arrest at 3:20 p.m. Mobile time. At 1:30 p.m. in Los Angeles, Buliosi, Stovitz, and Compton met with Chief Davis. Buliosi laid out his concerns bluntly. He had barely scraped together enough evidence against Krenwinkel and Kasabian to get warrants, but it was all inadmissible hearsay. Leslie Sankston's statement to McGann and Susan Atkins' statements to Virginia Graham and Ronnie Howard. "We can't get a grand jury indictment on this," Buliosi warned. "If Susan Atkins doesn't cooperate, we've had it." But Davis was unmovable. Over 200 reporters and cameramen were already waiting in the police auditorium, representing not just all the major networks and wire services, but newspapers from around the world. There was no turning back now. Shortly before the press conference, Lieutenant Helder called both Roman Polanski and Colonel Paul Tate with the news. For Colonel Tate, Sharon's father, this marked the end of his months-long private investigation. Despite his diligence, he hadn't uncovered anything useful to the case. But at least now the wondering and suspicion were over. At 2 p.m., Chief Edward M. Davis faced 15 microphones and dozens of bright lights to make his announcement. After 8,750 hours of police work, LAPD had solved the Tate case. Arrest warrants had been issued for 3 individuals: Charles D. Watson, 24, in custody in McKinney, Texas; Patricia Krenwinkel, 21, in custody in Mobile, Alabama; and Linda Kasabian, age and whereabouts unknown. Davis added that an additional 4 or 5 persons would be named in indictments sought from the Los Angeles County Grand Jury. Notably, neither Charles Manson nor Susan Atkins was mentioned by name during the press conference. Then came the bombshell that stunned many of the journalists present. These same individuals, Davis announced, were also involved in the murders of Rosemary and Leno LaBianca. This revelation shocked most of the newsmen, as LAPD had insisted almost from the beginning that there was no connection between the 2 homicides. Although a few reporters had suspected the crimes were linked, they hadn't been able to convince LAPD of their theories. The Los Angeles Police Department wishes to express their appreciation for the magnificent cooperation rendered by other law enforcement agencies during the development of information regarding both of the above cases, Davis continued, in particular the Los Angeles Sheriff's Office. What Davis failed to mention was that it had taken LAPD over 2 months to follow up on the lead that the Sheriff's Office had provided them the day after the Tate murders. When questioned by reporters, Davis attributed the breakthrough to tenacious investigation carried on by robbery-homicide detectives. He stated that investigators developed a suspicion which caused them to do a vigorous amount of work in this Spahn Ranch area, and the people connected with Spahn Ranch, which led us to where we are today. Perhaps not surprisingly, there was no mention of the 10-cent phone call from Susan Atkins' cellmate that had actually broken the case wide open. As soon as the press conference ended, reporters raced for the phones. The Tate-LaBianca murder story would dominate headlines across the nation the next day. But for Vincent Bugliosi, this was just the beginning of his challenges. With the case now public, the pressure was mounting to deliver indictments and convictions, and the biggest question remained unanswered. Would Susan Atkins cooperate? For Buliosi, the press conference had come too soon. He knew that the evidence they had gathered was circumstantial at best, not enough for grand jury indictments, let alone convictions. Without Susan Atkins' testimony, the entire case could collapse. The world now knew that arrests had been made in the Tate-LaBianca murders. What they didn't know was how tenuous the prosecutor's case actually was. December 2nd, 1969. While most of America prepared for the holiday season, a young prosecutor named Vincent Bugliosi was piecing together the brutal murders that had terrorized Los Angeles that summer. The Tate-LaBianca killings had shocked the nation, but the breakthrough in the case would come from an unexpected source, from within the killer's own family. Let me take you back to a crucial meeting. Attorney Richard Caballero placed a call to Sergeant Aaron. He had a client, Susan Atkins, who he wanted to interview on tape, but not just anywhere, not at Sybil Brand Women's Prison where other Manson girls might overhear. He needed somewhere private, somewhere Susan might feel more comfortable. This wasn't standard procedure by any means, but these weren't standard circumstances. A judge named William Keene signed the removal order, and that evening, Susan Atkins was escorted by 2 sheriff's deputies to Caballero's office. There, Caballero and his associate Paul Caruso interviewed her on tape. Caballero later told Aaron the recording would serve 2 purposes. First, for psychiatrists if he pursued an insanity plea, and second, if they proceeded with their deal, to assist the prosecution before they took the case to the grand jury. By December 2nd, 1969, the net had closed. All 5 suspects were in custody. Linda Kasabian had just surrendered voluntarily to police in Concord, New Hampshire. According to her mother, Linda admitted to being present at the Tate residence, but claimed she hadn't participated in the murders. Unlike some of the others, she wasn't fighting extradition. But in Texas, things were playing out very differently. Charles Tex Watson had been apprehended in McKinney, Texas, less than 30 miles north of Dallas and only a few miles from his hometown of Farmersville. The same small town that had given America war hero Audie Murphy now had a very different kind of local celebrity. For those of you who don't know Audie Murphy, he has been described as the most highly decorated enlisted soldier in U.S. history. He received every military combat award for valor available from the United States Army, as well as French and Belgian awards for heroism. Murphy received the Medal of Honor for valor that he demonstrated at age 19 for single-handedly holding off a company of German soldiers for an hour at the Colmar Pocket in France in January 1945, before leading a successful counterattack while wounded. After World War II, he went on to become a huge movie star, starring in mostly westerns, but also the lead role in a movie called To Hell and Back, an autobiographical account of Murphy's World War II experiences in which Murphy plays himself. It was the biggest hit ever for Universal Studios at the time. In the unlikely event that they make a movie about Tex Watson, To Hell and Back would seem a pretty appropriate title. Although their experiences on Western movie sets couldn't have been more different. By the time LAPD detectives Sartucci and Nielsen arrived in McKinney, the news had already broken. Local papers painted a picture of Watson that residents could scarcely reconcile with the charges he faced. An A student, a star athlete in football, basketball, and track. A young man who still held the state record for the low hurdles. Charles was the boy next door, one resident told reporters. It was drugs that did it, an uncle claimed. He started taking them at college, and that was where the trouble began. The principal of Farmersville High School was quoted saying, "It almost makes you afraid to send your kids off to college anymore." On the instruction of Watson's attorney, Bill Boyd, the Los Angeles detectives weren't allowed to speak to their suspect. Sheriff Montgomery wouldn't even permit them to fingerprint him. The detectives did catch a glimpse of Watson as he passed them on the stairs. They later reported that he was well-dressed, clean-shaven, with short hair. He looked like, and I quote, "a clean-cut college boy," a far cry from the wild-eyed killer described at the crime scenes. While in McKinney, the detectives confirmed that Watson had moved to California in 1967 and hadn't returned to Texas until November 1969, long after the murders. Sartucci and Nielsen flew back to Los Angeles convinced they'd get little cooperation from Texas authorities. It wasn't just about Watson's family connections. Somehow, the whole affair had become entangled in state politics. Little cooperation would prove to be a gross understatement. Meanwhile, reporters were busy tracing the family's nomadic wanderings and interviewing members who weren't in custody. Though still uncharged with the murders, Charles Manson had taken center stage. His followers spoke of him in almost mythical terms. Sandy Good said, "The first time I heard him sing, it was like an angel." Squeaky said he gave off a lot of magic, but he was sort of a changeling. He seemed to change every time I saw him. He seemed ageless. There were also interviews with family members of the suspects. Joseph Krenwinkel recalled how in September 1967, his daughter Patricia had abruptly left her Manhattan Beach apartment, her job, and her car, not even picking up a paycheck due to her, to join Manson. "I'm convinced he was some kind of hypnotist," Krenwinkel said. He wasn't the only one making that suggestion. Outside the Santa Monica courtroom where Susan Atkins had just pleaded not guilty to the Hinman murder, her attorney Caballero told reporters that Susan was under the hypnotic spell of Manson and had nothing to do with the murders, despite her presence at both the Hinman and Tate residences. Caballero also revealed something crucial. His client was going to appear before the grand jury and tell the complete story. This was the first confirmation prosecutors had that Susan Atkins had agreed to cooperate. That same day, LAPD interviewed a 17-year-old girl named Barbara Hoyt, whose parents had persuaded her to contact police. Barbara had lived with the family off and on since April 1969, staying with them at Spahn, Myers, and Barker ranches. Her story emerged gradually over several interviews. What she revealed was chilling. One evening at Spahn Ranch, about a week after an August 16th police raid, Barbara had heard screams that seemed to come from down the creek. They lasted 5 to 10 minutes. She was certain they belonged to a ranch hand known as Shorty. After that night, she never saw Shorty again. The next day, she overheard Manson tell Danny DiCarlo that Shorty had committed suicide, and I quote, "with a little help from us." Manson had also asked DiCarlo if Lime would dispose of a body. While at Myers Ranch in early September, Barbara overheard Manson tell someone that it had been real hard killing Shorty once he had been brought to now. They'd hit him over the head with a pipe, Manson said, then everyone had stabbed him, and finally someone named Clem had chopped off his head. After that, they'd cut him into 9 pieces. Still at Myers, Barbara had also overheard Sadie, Susan Atkins' family name, tell another member called Weish about the murders of Abigail Folger and Sharon Tate. Later, Weish told Barbara she knew of 10 other people the group had murdered. Not long after this, Barbara and another girl, Sherry Ann Cooper, also known as Simi Valley Sherry, fled the family's Death Valley hideout. Manson caught up with them in a place called Ballarat, but because other people were present, let them go. He even gave them $20 for bus fare back to Los Angeles. Although terrified, Barbara agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. That cooperation, as we'll discover later, would nearly cost her life. The Manson family was beginning to fracture. The loyalty that had bound them to their leader was giving way to fear, self-preservation, and perhaps even the faintest flickers of conscience. As 1969 drew to a close, prosecutors were on the verge of piecing together one of the most bizarre and horrifying murder cases America had ever seen. But the family wouldn't go down without a fight, and Charles Manson still had cards to play. After the break, we'll find out a surprising member of the Manson family to help the police. Another of Manson's girls agreed to help the police. She was the last person from whom Buliosi expected cooperation, Mary Brunner, the first member of the Manson family. Interviewed in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, where she had gone following her release from jail, Mary Brunner agreed to cooperate with the police in return for immunity in the Hinman murder. She supplied numerous details regarding that crime. She also said that in the latter part of September 1969, Tex Watson had told her about the murder of Shorty. They had buried his body near the railroad tracks at Spawn, Tex said, and Gypsy abandoned his car in Canoga Park near a residence the family had previously occupied on Gresham Street. Obviously, Mary Brunner would be an important witness in both the Hinman and Shea cases, although she had been in jail when the Tate and LaBianca murders occurred. According to others interviewed, her devotion to Manson was fanatical. Would she testify against the father of her child? Because of the time difference, it was nearly midnight of December 1st, before reports of the hippie kill cult reached London. As in the United States, the sensational dispatches dominated the headlines of the papers the next day. At 11 that morning, a maid in the Talgarth Hotel on Talgarth Road in London tried to open the door of a room occupied by an American youth named Joel Pugh. It was locked from the inside. Shortly after 6 p.m., the hotel manager unlocked the door with a passkey. It only opened about 1 foot, he stated. There seemed to be a weight behind it. Kneeling down and reaching in, he felt what seemed like an arm. He hastily called the police. A constable from Hammersmith Station arrived minutes later and pushed the door open. Behind it was the body of Joel Pugh. He was lying on his back, unclothed except for a sheet over the lower half of his body. His throat had been slit twice. There was a bruise on his forehead, slash marks on both wrists, and 2 bloody razor blades, one less than 2 feet from the body. There were no notes, although there were some writings in reverse on the mirror, along with some comic book-type drawings. According to the manager, Pugh had checked into the room on October 27th with a young lady who had left after 3 weeks. A hippie in appearance, Pugh was quiet, went out rarely, seemed to have no friends. There being no wound not incapable of being self-inflicted, the coroner's inquest concluded that Pugh took his own life while the balance of his mind was disturbed. Although the circumstances of the death, including the wounds themselves, were equally if not more consistent with murder, it was considered a routine suicide. No one thought the drawings or writings important enough to take down. The manager later recalled only the words Jack and Jill. No attempt was made to determine the time of death. Nor, though Pugh's room was on the ground floor and could be entered and left through the window, did anyone feel it necessary to check for latent prints. At the time, no one connected the death with the big American news that day. If it hadn't been for a brief reference in a letter over a month later, the Manson investigators probably would have remained unaware that Joel Dean Pugh, age 29, former Manson family member and husband of family member Sandra Good, had joined the lengthening list of mysterious deaths connected with the case. When she and Squeaky moved out of their motel room in Independence, Sandy left some papers behind. Among them was a letter from an unidentified former family member which contained the line, "I would not want what happened to Joel to happen to me." It was known that Bruce Davis, who was present at both the Hinman murder and the Shorty Shea murder, had been in London sometime earlier, but it was never confirmed if he was there at the time of Pugh's murder. Stephen K., Buliosi's young assistant, later said, Manson despised Pugh and people who Manson hated usually ended up dead. Imagine sitting in a room with a young woman, just 21 years old, with long brown hair and a distant, far-off look in her eyes. She speaks in a flat, emotionless voice as she describes, with all the casualness of someone recounting a trip to the grocery store, how she participated in the brutal murders of 7 people. This is not fiction. This happened in December 1969 when prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi first heard the voice of Susan Atkins. On December 4, 1969, Los Angeles was still reeling from the savage murders that had occurred 4 months earlier. The victims included actress Sharon Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant, and 4 others at her Benedict Canyon home, followed by the LaBianca couple in Los Feliz the next night. The brutality of these killings sent shockwaves through Hollywood and beyond. While the city trembled, prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi was about to face the darkness head-on. That evening, defense attorney Richard Caballero arrived at LAPD headquarters with something extraordinary, a tape recording of his client, Susan Atkins, confessing to her involvement in these murders. As Buliosi and several detectives listened in silence, a young girl's voice filled the room. What struck them wasn't just what she said, but how she said it. With a flat, emotionless tone, occasionally punctuated by giggles, Susan Atkins described the slaughter of 7 human beings. At one point, referring to Sharon Tate's final moments, she laughed and said, "And Sharon went through quite a few changes. Quite a few changes." Buliosi found himself wondering, what kind of creature is this? The next day, Buliosi would interview Susan Atkins personally. The woman he met was petite, 5'5", 120 pounds, with long brown hair and brown eyes. Her face wasn't unattractive, but there was something deeply unsettling about her expression. She had what Buliosi described as a distant, far-off look in her eyes, even more pronounced than other members of the so-called family. Despite her youth, Susan had already lived many lives. A high school dropout after her mother died of cancer, she'd been a hustler, topless dancer, and what she called a gun mole before meeting Charles Manson. A gun mole is early 1900s slang for the female companion, girlfriend, or mistress of a male professional criminal or mob leader. Buliosi felt pity for her troubled past, but it was difficult to summon much compassion after seeing photos of what had been done to the Tate victims. Throughout the interview, there was something mysterious about Susan. She would talk rapidly for a few minutes, then pause, head slightly cocked to the side, as if hearing voices no one else could. At one point, she looked at Buliosi and said with absolute conviction, "You know, Charlie is looking at us right now, and he can hear everything we are saying." When Buliosi reminded her that Manson was locked up in Independence, California, she simply smiled, secure in her belief that he was wrong, and she, the insider, the believer, was right. On December 5, 1969, Susan Atkins appeared before the Los Angeles County Grand Jury. Outside the chambers, about 100 reporters crowded the narrow hallway, some standing on tables to get a better view, desperate for any snippet of information about the proceedings that were, by law, secret. Inside, 21 jurors, predominantly upper-middle class, upper-middle-aged citizens, were about to hear testimony that would challenge their understanding of the human condition. Atkins began by describing how she met Charles Manson 2 years earlier in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district. A man had walked into the house where she was staying, carrying a guitar, and was immediately surrounded by young women. When he sang "The Shadow of Your Smile," Susan thought he sounded like an angel. But what truly blew her mind was when Manson seemed to read her thoughts. After handing her his guitar, she thought to herself, "I can't play this," though she hadn't spoken aloud. Manson looked at her and said, "You can play that if you want to." Susan was convinced he had been inside her head and knew immediately that he was something that I had been looking for. Her response? "I went down and kissed his feet." What followed was a bizarre courtship. When Manson told her he wanted to make love to her, he instructed her to stand naked before a mirror and picture in your mind that I am your father. Susan described this as a very beautiful experience. Before meeting Manson, she said she felt she was lacking something. But after giving herself to him, he gave me back to myself. He gave me the faith in myself to be able to know that I am a woman. Soon after, Susan joined Manson's nomadic family, traveling in an old-school bus furnished with colorful rugs and pillows. They roamed from Northern California to Mexico, eventually settling at Spahn Ranch near Los Angeles. The girls all made love with each of the boys and with each other. But Charlie, Susan said, was complete love. When asked if there was any limit to what she would do for Manson, her answer was simple: no. Why did these young women fall so deeply under his spell? Susan explained. Charlie is the only man I have ever met on the face of this earth that is a complete man. He will not take back talk from a woman. He will not let a woman talk him into doing anything. He is a man. For all the strange philosophy and sexual experimentation, there was something more sinister brewing at Spahn Ranch. The family engaged in what they called creepy crawling, entering random homes at night while the occupants slept, moving things around and leaving without being detected. Everyone carried a knife. They wore dark clothing and moved in silence. Looking back, these nocturnal invasions seem eerily like dress rehearsals for murder. Then came August 8, 1969. Susan testified that Charles Manson instructed her to get a change of clothing and a knife and to do exactly what Tex Watson told her to do. She, along with Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, drove to a house that used to belong to Terry Melcher, a record producer who had previously rejected Manson's musical aspirations. When Buliosi asked why they were going to this house, Susan replied matter-of-factly, to get all of their money and to kill whoever was there. It didn't matter who was home. They were instructed to kill them all. What happened next was pure horror. After cutting telephone wires and climbing a fence to enter the property, they encountered Stephen Parent in his car near the gate. Tex Watson shot him 4 times. Susan's description of seeing Parent's body was chilling. She referred to him as the thing I saw in the car. When asked to clarify, she coldly acknowledged, yes, a human being. The 4 intruders then approached the main house. Inside, they found Wojtek Frykowski asleep on the couch. When he woke up and asked who they were, Tex replied with words that would become infamous. I am the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business. Susan checked the house and found 3 more people. Abigail Folger reading in one bedroom, and Jay Sebring and Sharon Tate talking in another. Sharon, who was 8 months pregnant, was lying on the bed. Once all the victims were gathered in the living room, Sebring asked Watson to let Sharon sit down because of her pregnancy. For his concern, Sebring was shot immediately. What followed was chaos and carnage. Frykowski managed to free himself and fought with Susan. Abigail Folger broke free and struggled with Patricia Krenwinkel before being caught and stabbed by Watson. Meanwhile, Sharon Tate begged for her life and the life of her unborn child. Please let me go, she pleaded. All I want to do is have my baby. Susan's response was bone-chilling. Woman, I have no mercy for you. She added, I knew that I was talking to myself, not to her. In her testimony, Susan claimed that she couldn't bring herself to kill Sharon and instead held her while Watson stabbed her. But the autopsy would later show that Sharon Tate had been stabbed 16 times, and Susan had reportedly told fellow inmate Ronnie Howard something very different. I just kept stabbing her until she stopped screaming. Before leaving, Susan dipped a towel in Sharon Tate's blood and wrote the word pig on the front door of the house. As they drove away, they discarded their bloody clothes and weapons at various locations. When they returned to Spahn Ranch around 2 a.m., Charles Manson was waiting for them. He asked, What are you doing home so early? Watson reported that it all happened perfectly, but that there had been a lot of panic, concluding with the phrase, Boy, it sure was helter-skelter. The very next night, the killing continued. Manson told them they were going to go out and do the same thing we did the last night, only 2 different houses. This time, Manson himself entered the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, tied them up, and then sent in Watson, Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten to kill them. According to Susan's account of what Patricia told her later, Rosemary LaBianca heard her husband being murdered and cried out, What are you doing to my husband? Before she too was stabbed to death. After the murders, someone wrote, Death to all pigs and helter-skelter in blood on the walls, and carved the word war on Leno LaBianca's stomach. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the killers then took showers, fixed themselves something to eat in the kitchen, and left, assuming the LaBianca's children would discover their parents' bodies when they came for Sunday dinner later that day. Throughout her entire testimony, Susan Atkins never showed a trace of remorse, sorrow, or guilt. The jurors stared at her in disbelief as she nonchalantly stepped down from the witness stand. How could this young woman describe such barbaric acts with such detachment? When asked what these murders were supposed to accomplish, Susan replied simply, to instill fear into the establishment. She explained that helter-skelter, a phrase Manson had taken from a Beatles song, was meant to be the last war on the face of the earth, something that no man could conceive of in his imagination. The grand jury room that day was tense. the air heavy with the weight of what they'd already heard. Susan Atkins, the young woman who had been part of the killing spree at the Tate residence, had just been escorted out. Her testimony had painted a horrific picture of what transpired on those August nights. Next came Wilfred Parent, a father forced to identify his son Stephen in a high school prom picture. Stephen was just 18 when he was brutally murdered, simply because he happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time, visiting the Tate residence's caretaker on that fateful night. One by one, photos of the other victims were shown to witnesses for identification. The glamorous actress Sharon Tate, 8.5 months pregnant, coffee heiress Abigail Folger, hairstylist Jay Sebring, and Wojciech Frykowski, Folger's lover. Housekeeper Winifred Chapman took the stand next. Her testimony might have seemed mundane at first glance, that she had washed the front door of the Tate residence shortly before noon on Friday, August 8th. But in Bugliosi's careful construction of the case, this detail was crucial. It meant that any fingerprints found on that door had to have been left after Mrs. Chapman departed at 4 p.m., directly linking Charles Tex Watson to the scene of the crime during the critical time frame. But it was the next witness who perhaps held the most tantalizing clues about what had triggered these seemingly senseless killings. Terry Melcher, music producer and son of actress Doris Day, took the stand. He described meeting Manson and how Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys had once driven Manson to Melcher's rented home at Cielo Drive, the very address that would later become the site of the Tate massacre. Melcher told of his 2 visits to Spahn Ranch, the dilapidated old movie set where Manson and his followers lived. The connection was significant. By the time of the murders, Melcher had moved out, and Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski had moved in. But what did this mean? What was the connection? Family members had claimed Melcher made numerous promises to record Manson's music, promises he didn't keep. Under oath, Melcher denied making any such promises. He admitted giving Manson $50 during his first visit to Spahn Ranch, but claimed it was out of pity, for food, not an advance on any recording contract. When asked about Manson's musical talent, Melcher's response was tellingly bland. He wasn't impressed enough to allot the time necessary to record him. Buliosi later reflected that he sensed Melcher was withholding something. But like many grand jury witnesses, Melcher was there for a very specific purpose. The deeper questioning would have to wait. Dr. Thomas Noguchi, the Los Angeles coroner whose meticulous work would earn him the nickname Coroner to the Stars, was the final witness that day. He detailed his grim autopsy findings on the 5 Tate victims, the clinical language doing little to soften the brutality of what had been done to them. With that, the session adjourned until Monday. But outside the grand jury room, speculation ran wild. The press, hungry for explanations of the inexplicable violence, latched onto easy narratives. That afternoon, the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner's headline blared, "Tate Killers Wild on LSD, Grand Jurors Told." It was completely false. Susan Atkins had testified to exactly the opposite, that none of the killers were on drugs either night. But the myth had taken root, perhaps because it offered the comforting explanation people desperately needed, that only drug-induced madness could explain such savagery. In the months and years that followed, Americans would struggle to understand what happened in those 2 nights of savagery in Los Angeles. Many would cling to the easy explanation that the killers were wild on LSD, a myth that persisted despite Susan's clear testimony that they were not on drugs during either night of murder. The truth, as Vincent Bugliosi would discover, was far more disturbing. Charles Manson wanted his assassins in complete control of their faculties as they carried out his orders. Through psychological manipulation, not chemical influence, he had turned these young people into killers who could slaughter innocent human beings and feel nothing. As we reflect on these events over 50 years later, the question remains, how did Charles Manson transform seemingly ordinary young people into remorseless killers? What darkness did he tap into? And could it happen again? In our next episode, we'll explore how prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi built his case against Manson despite never having physical evidence placing him at either murder scene. And remember the gun found by 10-year-old Stephen Weiss? Prepare to be shocked when you find out what happened to that. Earlier I mentioned Abbott and Costello. Well, Scotland has its own version of Abbott and Costello, and we'll hear from them after this quick break.
Alex, for goodness sake, the amount of information you're throwing at us now, the avenues this inquiry is going down, we need to talk about interviews, we need to talk about the whole diversity of this case. It covers just about every aspect of police work here, including the recovery and preservation of evidence. But the one thing, Tom, I wanted to ask you about was the number of hours, the police hours that had gone into the inquiry by this stage, 8,750. That just sounds like a normal serious crime squad week to me.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because here you've got a lot of law enforcement agencies coming together in this vast investigation, and they've all got budgets, and some of these budgets are tighter than others, and some of them have got political priorities not the same as the others. And so this is the problem in the United States, is trying to tie all these together. And this is the advantage of the task force system, because when the task force is brought together, there's a commander appointed, there's a budget given, and everybody's sharing in that, and also sharing in the intelligence and the product that's coming on a non-judgmental basis. So in other words, if a small force has made a pig's ear of something and hasn't taken fingerprints or hasn't taken crime scene photographs, then when the task force system comes into being, they can actually come forward and say, look, we've fallen down on this, we've got to make up for this. And so this is the benefit of it. And I don't know yet, and Alex is going to find out for us, whether in fact that ever came about.
Tom, an interesting part of what you've just said then now gives me the answer to what I was going to ask you, was that about leaks from the police to the press to... Leaks can come in all sorts of ways. I've just done a story for Small Town Dex, our friends, and it was about information being leaked that was causing problems for our policing of the drug scene. But those leaks might just be loose talk. It might just be pillow talk. It doesn't need to be for money. It doesn't need to be corrupt. Sometimes it is, of course, to the press. The press will pay police officers for information like that. What you're suggesting is that if they bring a squad together that are tight-knit working together, the information can stay in-house. And if there are any leaks, it's much more easily identified, the source of it, than if you've got multiple enforcement agencies working the case.
Oh, well, that's true. And I mean, this would be particularly the case with the Tate case. The Hollywood press, which was very, very active then and now, would be all over this. We've talked already about Sharon Tate, how she was found in her negligee and she was 8 months pregnant, etc., etc. You can just imagine how hot they would be chasing that story. The problem that can come, and I've been involved in an investigation like this, where there are leaks to the press and the investigation into the leaks actually starts to take precedence over the investigation into the crime. Mm-hmm. And you've got to be really careful that you don't get distracted. Perhaps the classic example in Scotland, certainly, of distraction was the so-called Bible John. And we've talked about Bible John before, and we'll no doubt talk about Bible John again, because it was a defining investigation into a man who didn't exist. But it was a defining investigation for all of us who were involved in the 1980s, as we both were. And that was a good example of, they were so desperate to find out where all the leaks were coming from that it took away from the focus of the case. And by the way, there were some super detectives, very, very good detectives through your side of the country who were involved in that case. So I just want to make very clear, we're not talking about second-rate investigation, we're just talking about the circumstances overwhelmed them.
Tom, in this episode 16, we start off with the identification of the print. We know who he is at this point because we've heard the first 15 episodes. Charles Denton Watson, or we've known him as Tex, who was really Manson's lieutenant on the night of these murders. He had delegated him to lead a lot of the crime that they were committing, the creepy crawly stuff and all that at the time. Here we get a fingerprint identification, and he's not anywhere near LA, he's away in his hometown. It was great. The sheriff that was out there was great, wasn't he, that was tasked to find him and keep him in custody.
In a story which is, so far, has not done much credit to the police service, generally police service. I was really pleased actually to hear this bit about this sheriff who is related to Tex, but who does his job without fear or favour.
Yeah.
A small town sheriff, and he gets the investigation. He could have fudged it. He could have made a phone call. He could have given Tex prior notice, but he doesn't. He plays it straight off the bat and phones up and says, listen, get him down here. We've got a job to do. It's another example, Simon. Here we have a fingerprint taken from the scene of the crime, incriminating fingerprint in blood. And here we have a latent print which is out there in the ether, on record in another part of the country, under another name, and tying that up together. This is the great advantage now of our computerised systems. The Scottish Criminal Records Office and the National Fingerprint Database. And that could not happen now because the computer would make the match.
Tom, you were talking at the end of the last episode about the different interests at the different enforcement agencies. You would think everybody would be focused on solving the crimes, but that oversimplifies it when you bring the political system where it interfaces with law enforcement in the States, all the different geographies and areas and people looking after their own self-interest. We have a sample of that with the LAPD because the chief seems determined to have a press conference. All he wants to do is have some positive headlines, but it's far too soon. And of course, Buliosi knows that, but he's only got so much that he can do to stop it happening.
Well, that's right. There's a lot about this story, which is history, which you look at it and you think, that couldn't happen now because of this and that. But here we have a police chief determined to grab the first slice of credit. And so he goes off half-cocked. Well, that could still happen today, very much. And by the way, not just in the police service, it happens all the time in politics, all the time. Desperate to grab the credit, they go off half-cocked. And sometimes the investigation is a consequence of it. Yeah.
Tom, did you ever think you did too soon or too late? Or in retrospect, looking back over a long career as a senior investigating officer, making decisions like that, which are very important in the context of a trial coming up. What would you think of those decisions looking back?
Yeah, I can think of one instance where I think we had a press conference too early. I thought it was going to leak to the press, and so I decided to preempt that. When I think about it now, I don't think I had proper evidence to justify that. And of course, once you have a press release and say we're investigating this particular murder, then you set all the hairs running. Yeah. You know, you really do. You start the race. You fired the gun, you started the race. So I think if I had my time again, I wouldn't have done that as quickly. And I took advice and I listened to advice, and the advice was contradictory. And at the end of the day, you've got to make a decision.
Yeah.
And I used to work with a great detective, Hector Clark. He said to me, Tom, he said, when I'm asked to make a decision, he said, he said, always think, I've got 51% chance of being right. which I thought was fantastic. And by the way, there was no more experienced murder squad detective than Hector Clark. Not in my day, anyway. I mean, he was incredible. He was under no illusions about his own fallibility. I think as an SIO, you've got to be that. Once you start believing that you're extraordinary and can do no wrong, then you're heading for a fall.
Thanks for that, Tom. I said at the start that the fingerprint was the big break, but there was another part of that as well, which brings in jailhouse snitches, which you and I have dealt with a lot over the years. But this was the cellmate of Susan Atkins, and that really broke the case as well, as did Susan Atkins later in this episode when we discovered whether she was going to speak up, because the control that Manson had over all of these people, especially the females, was absolutely astonishing, wasn't it?
Absolutely incredible. The control he had on these people was absolutely mesmeric. But what interests me about Susan Atkins is clearly the linchpin in this case. Yeah. And yet it's ages before anybody actually joins the dots and realises her worth and her value. And how often have you seen that? Yeah. You've got a valuable piece of information or evidence lying in a corner there somewhere, and it takes ages to... And of course, from an outside observer's point of view, as we're doing now, looking at this case in hindsight, I mean, let's be frank. It's easy to be smart and wise in hindsight for us.
Yeah.
But looking at this case, why don't you go and speak to Susan Atkins, for God's sake?
The same was true of Mary Brunner as well, who was his first member. But there was interviews going on. Tom, that thing you said about creating a squad, what is it you called it in America?
Task
task force.
Task force, yeah.
Bringing that together. One of the benefits of that, you especially managed the thing. Within that task force, you've got trustees, i.e. detectives that you've known for a long time. They're maybe hand-picked. I knew lots of senior officers. You knew who their office manager was going to be. You knew who was going to be running the door-to-door. You knew because they trusted these guys and they knew what their strengths were and knew what their weaknesses might be too. So you can hand-pick people. It seems to me that there was people interviewing absolutely crucial witnesses, these females that are in custody, split up now. The interviews are going to be crucial to the case. But it was the wrong guys that were interviewing. There's one with Diane Lake where he goes in and immediately tries to bully her into giving him the info. Maybe he was late for his lunch or something, but the whole thing was rushed and handled the wrong way, whereas he was maybe the wrong man for the job. Is that a big part of what your job was then, to pick the right men for the right tasks?
Very much so. And of course, latterly, people were qualified in interview techniques. It wasn't a case of just picking someone who you liked, were people who were well qualified. I thought that was a remarkably revealing passage because, I mean, the nice man, nasty man works to a degree. It's the oldest cliche in policing, but it works to a degree. But this business of going in and immediately...
Who were you, Tom? Who were you when you were a younger detective? Were you the good guy or the bad guy?
I don't think that even merits a response because it's obvious.
We're back to that Chatham thing again.
Yes, we are, Simon. We are. I think our listening audience will agree with me. I'm sure they will. I think it's obvious.
It's true, you put on a good face here.
It's the only face I've got, unfortunately, Simon. But no, coming back to it, this business of going in, guns blazing, shouting and bawling and threatening and stuff, there's no way back from that.
No,
there's no way. If that doesn't work, where do you go then?
You get one shot.
All credit to you. I know enough about you and your personality. When you were interviewing someone, you'd always try and give them a bit of chat and try and build a rapport. And you get an awful lot better out of that. It's the old adage that you got a lot further with sugar rather than vinegar. It's true. True of interviewing as well. Sure. And time without number, I've interviewed someone and dealt with someone, and it's paid dividends, not that day, not that week, but 6 months later or a year later, you'll get a call, such and such is in the cell, he's asked to see you, and you'll go down and say, what are you in for now? I remember when I was detective super, I got a call from the cell saying there's a guy here who wants to see you. He knew you when you were a detective sergeant. And I went down and here's this guy, and I knew him when he was a teenager, and he's about 25 years old. I said, what are you in for? I just, you were always square with me, and I just wondered about this. And he was looking for advice of how best to handle himself.
Yeah.
He was just looking for that. Now, if I'd knocked that fellow about or if I'd abused him when he was a teenager, I wouldn't have got that phone call.
Yeah, you're sowing seeds all the time. And I think the word I would look for in there is respect, Tom. Sometimes it's hard because you're dealing with people who've committed horrific crimes or they're suspect of at the time. But very few respond to what you're talking about. There has to be a meeting of personalities in there, especially with criminals who are lifetime criminals. Because I've said this before and I'll say it again, I didn't know any main index criminals who weren't informing to the police at some level at some point in their careers. There's a relationship there, a mutual benefit in there for those relationships, but you've got to nurture them, and it all starts with that respect. But in this case, we've got people interviewing, wrong kind of interview. There was no control really, Tom. That's the point I'm trying to make.
No, that's right. There was no control. What you've got is a group of vulnerable young women who have themselves been victimised, who are in the mind control of Charlie Manson, but who, if they were managed and handled carefully, I think a lot more of them would have given up information. And of course, as the case goes on, we'll perhaps see more of that. But yeah, I thought the example of that, going in and threatening somebody with an electric chair and all the rest of it, But I have to say, Simon, and you'll remember this from your younger days, I remember some policemen that used to do that. They weren't successful, but I do remember policemen that used to do that.
Yeah.
We can't sit on the high moral ground of Scotland and say this never happened here, because it did.
Yeah, for sure. And emotions can get high at these times. Emotions can get running away with you. And you will get criminals, you and I have spoken about this before, who are clever. It's not the case that all criminals are stupid. They know the buttons to press to wind up police officers the same as they do in their everyday lives. And some officers can rise to that as well. That's where management comes in. People that can realise these things are dangerous to the case.
Charlie Manson is perhaps the best example of someone who is incredibly manipulative. He's a man who has built a cult and engendered such fierce loyalty. By the way, let's not forget, his family had been dragged through the dirt, they'd been living in the desert, they'd been starving, they'd been sent out to rake food out of buckets. They hadn't been living in luxury, and yet he had this Svengali-like control over them, because they thought he was Christ.
Yes.
And it was very, very telling where one of them's been interviewed, and she says, I'm like, oh, Charlie will not like that. And the interviewer said, Charlie will not know because he's 100 miles away in prison. And she just gave a knowing smile as if to say, but Charlie will know anyway.
I think she said that. Charlie's listening to all of this.
Yeah, they are. That Charlie was some sort of external deity who had so much power over all. Yeah.
And part of that comes out when Atkins does give evidence to the grand jury, which is never a certainty. These type of people are so unpredictable, you never know when they're telling the truth. A lot of it centred around whether she could get candy or whatnot. She gives evidence to the grand jury, and it gives Alec a chance to reprise the murders and the murder scenes, the locus, etc. She relates all that to the grand jury, as we know it from the previous 15 episodes. But the thing about it that's striking is that she shows no sorrow, no grief, no compassion, no outward sign of what actually occurred, the horror of what occurred. It was all to do with her and the family. It was all about themselves and discovery of themselves. Nothing about the victims, even Tate, even talking about Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant, and how she was killed horrifically. She actually took her blood on a rag and wrote "pig" on the door with the blood of Sharon Tate. But no remorse or anything, Tom.
I know a young woman who takes part in the brutal murder of an 8-month pregnant young woman, Sharon Tate, who is begging for the life of her child.
Yeah.
And yet they cold-bloodedly stab her repeatedly. And as you say, no empathy, no remorse, nothing. And that just shows you the power that Manson had. And not just that, the power that he had, but also how good he'd been at selecting members of the family. We talked about this in earlier episodes, how he looked for people who were cracked but not broken. He looked for people who were malleable. He looked for people and he stripped them of their identity. He gave them nicknames to depersonalize them. He looked for people who had tough upbringings, who had dysfunctional families, these sort of things. Very, very clever the way he did that. And in terms of the way he selected, not just trained his cult and indoctrinated his cult members, but also selected them in the first place.
Tom, Alex threw in during the course of this, I knew that you would know something about it because it was more near your era, Audie Murphy, probably the greatest ever USA war hero who went on to become a movie star, to Hell and Back, the movie and all that. It was interesting that Alex threw it in. It seemed appropriate at the time, but it was a very interesting story, wasn't it?
What's remarkable about this whole thing, Simon, is the number of crossing points, the number of people that pitch up in the story, from the Beach Boys to the Beatles.
Yeah.
Here's Audie Murphy. Audie Murphy was one of the great, I think still, if you Google it, you'll see that Audie Murphy is the most decorated for valor American soldier of all time. I'm talking about enlisted soldiers, not generals who award their own medals. The remarkable thing about Audie Murphy was that If I remember correctly, and Alex will maybe correct me on this, I think he only joined the army in something like 1943. Because so all of his actions, and he won the Medal of Honour, which is the equivalent of our Victoria Cross, he won them all in the European theatre in the space of about 2 years. And of course, he's a very handsome young man, a small man, and so it wasn't a case of art imitating life. In other words, he wasn't a made-up film hero. He was a real hero who then went on to be a film star. There's incredible connections in this case. Abbott and Costello. I was thinking about you personally, Simon, because one of the cases actually involves the same location as the famous Keystone Cops films were made. And whenever I think of the Keystone Cops, I always think of Strathclyde Police, you know?
Yeah. Is that what Edinburgh Police modelled themselves on, was it? Because they were 20 odd years after us.
No, 5 years, in fact. 1800,
5 years.
City of Glasgow Police. 1805, the City of Edinburgh Police. And yes, we did. We modelled ourselves on the very best of the Glasgow policing system, which operated from about 1800 to about 1810. And thereafter it went down the drain.
All downhill after that.
All downhill. And then it took a sudden dive in about 1978. Everything went to...
Somebody's been doing their homework.
You can always depend on me doing my homework.
Yeah. Tom, just a couple of things. Our episodes are going to become longer than Alex because of the amount of issues that are raised during the course of it. There was one bit I wanted to pick your brains because I don't know anything about this, but one of the members of the family was found murdered. It was written off as a suicide, of course, in a hotel room in London. If you get any information about that, or is it something we can ask Alec to go into a wee bit more? Because it was written off as a suicide, and you and I know how easily that can happen if the dots aren't dotted and the T's aren't crossed.
Yeah, I did know something about this, Simon, but I'm not convinced it wasn't a suicide, to be honest.
No?
I think what you got to remember is that these conspiracies grow arms and legs. So Pew dies in the hotel in London. And the inference is that somehow Charlie Manson sent somebody to kill him. I'm a bit sceptical about that. I would have to see a lot more evidence of that.
Yeah.
Quite often in suicides, you've got a tentative cut.
Yes.
Either to your wrist, so you'll get 2 cuts. So there'll be a tentative cut, and then there'll be the fatal cut. That happens in throat cutting as well as wrists.
Yes.
It's called a tentative cut.
And you're not sure how deep it is or anything. You're not sure what you've done. Yeah, it's quite phenomenal. But we'll come back to it, no doubt.
The one thing we should mention is the business about state politics, how state politics starts to come into, as this case starts to reflect badly on elected politicians and the whole law and order thing. Remember that in the United States, the last thing an elected politician wants to appear is soft on crime. Murders of this importance and the publicity attached to the Tate killings, etc., start to get the politicians nervous. And when the politicians start getting nervous, they start bringing pressure upon police and the DAs.
I think that's going to come out in the next few episodes, Tom, when we get up to near the trial, and especially with you asking Alec to look behind it a wee bit for us. The thing I wanted to finish on was a bit later, was that the narrative, everybody was so unbelieving. It's like me saying to you, and we know better than to ask the question why, because there's some crimes we have witnessed and you could never, in a month of Sundays, being a rational person, understand why anyone would commit these crimes. And it's the same here. But people need something to latch onto, and the narrative became that they were all wild on LSD. Drugs became the thing, because people must be out of their mind to do things like this. Although Susan Atkins had told them quite categorically that there was no substances involved. They were all stone cold sober when they did this.
Mm-hmm. I do have some sympathy with it, because you can imagine when you're sitting there starting to figure out what the scenario in these cases were. They'd already decided that the case was all about drugs. Yeah. And that the other cases were about mafia, debt. So you can understand that, because that was what they were used to. That was a familiar pattern. If somebody, and we've said this before, I'm sure, if somebody had at the morning conference, excuse me, could this be a satanic cult, boss? Could this be, you would get, take the day off, would you? You're
Yeah. Tom, I'm looking forward to it. We've still got lots to go here because we're bringing the politics in now and all the different actors that will be looking to get a slice of this too. And of course, we've still got to the trial to go at some point down the road too. But we're getting there. We're starting to see, thanks to a couple of breaks, but you only get the breaks in a case when you do the legwork, don't you? And that's what Vincent is doing here. He's looking after the details. He's tracking down the leads. He's eliminating leads. He's doing the police work and the groundwork that needs to be done and starting to get the rewards for that, because some of the witnesses or some of the family members are starting to lose their nerve a wee bit, give us the truth and start talking about it.
That's right. Thank goodness for Mr. Buliosi. I think if I was the chief of the LAPD or the LA County Sheriffs, I'd be hanging my head in shame, because he is doing and drawing the strings together that they should have done.
Yeah. Tom, fantastic. I'm looking forward to episode 17, and I'll speak to you after Alex done his bit there.
Thanks very much, Simon. Nice to talk to you.